but we have to move on so to keep up with the time schedule. And so sanctions. So we thought that it would be better that we invite somebody outside of Raiffeisen to talk on sanctions. And I think nobody else but Christofer Weafer, CEO of Macro Advisory, could tell about sanctions like really exciting story. He has been working in Russia since 90s, had profound experience here in Russia and can share his knowledge here. So, Christofer Weafer, is it possible to do business when there are sanctions around you?
Thank you, Maria, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today and address your clients. So the short answer for your first question, is it possible? Yes, it is, very much so. And the whole question of sanctions really is about always trying to balance risk, perception of risk as well as real risk with opportunity. And over the last couple of years, we have heard many international companies talking about record profits in Russia, increased profits in Russia. And at the same time, of course, we still get asked about sanctions risk and what might happen. And it is a factor, therefore, delaying investors, even though when you look at the market and you look at what's happening, you can see a lot of big companies making lots of money in Russia. So it is for sure it's a factor. But as I show in the slide here, on slide 1, it's not the only factor, of course, that has affected investment in Russia or affected the economy of the last 7 years. If recall, of course, the sanctions regime started early 2014 as a direct result of the referendum in Crimea. And of course, we have had a steady progression of sanctions since. But also, at the same time, from later, about Q3 2014, we had the oil price starting a fairly steep decline. It went from over $100 in the summer of 2014 to about $40 or slightly under $40 12 months later. And of course, in the last few years, we've had the coronavirus pandemic. So there's been lots of other factors in parallel, and therefore it makes it difficult to just say what has been the specific impact of sanctions. But anecdotally, we certainly know that it is a factor that has held back lots of companies' willingness to invest in Russia. They've simply been nervous. But one piece of good news, though, is that we have seen over the last maybe 12 months, as companies are reporting increased profits in Russia, and as I think there's more comfort now with what's happening maybe between President Putin and President Biden, it seems certainly a lot more relaxed and a little calmer than we've had before. We are starting to see companies now more willing to look more closely at Russia and to better understand the risk. And I think that's optimistic as we look for the next couple of years. So if we look at sanctions specifically, say the major problem with sanctions is the accumulation. It's the fact that they have come at such a steady pace. We've almost had sanctions every 6 months. And therefore, companies are always worried about what happens next, even though they might say the sanctions that we've had so far at any particular point have not affected them or are okay, but they worry about what's next. We've had from our previous speakers talking about the Russian economy, the recovery, and about fiscal rule. And this is kind of one of the positives, I suppose, from sanctions, because it's not all negative. One of the positives of sanctions is that the Russian government have been forced to addressing some of the economic reforms that have been talked about and certainly long talked about in previous decade. But they have addressed them, certainly with regard to fiscal rule, budget management, balance sheet structure. And today, Russia has one of the best balance sheets in the world. It is the world's 5th lowest national debt to GDP, the world's 6th highest level of financial reserves to GDP of all countries in the world. And it's now run a budget surplus for the 6th straight month. Russia's budget, for example, will balance at approximately $60 Brent. The current price is over 80, whereas in 2013, pre-sanctions, it needed 115. So there's been positives as well, and a lot more pragmatism as a result of sanctions. If we look at just to highlight the sanctions, the major sanctions, it's a long list, and I have given a report to Raiffeisen, and I've told them they can freely share it with anybody who asks, which looks at these in more detail. Sanctions number 3 is the one that really had the greatest impact. This is the Combating America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. That made 2 changes. One is it gave control over sanctions relief, in other words, ending sanction, to Congress. And that's important because, of course, Congress always takes a very long time to make any such changes. So it means that sanctions that are now in place will remain almost indefinitely. And the second impact of CAATSA sanction number 3 is that it introduced secondary sanctions. So in other words, even though the sanctions that now come out of Congress in Washington apply directly to US investors, because of secondary sanctions, of course, investors in Austria and Europe and other international markets have to pay attention to those sanctions, because otherwise they may then be punished for taking advantage of the absence of American competitors. So we've had a number of them, but that's the main one that really was fundamental. Currently, where we are today, as I mentioned, there is definitely a better relationship between the White House and the Kremlin. It's much more pragmatic. There's a lot of kind of interaction and discussion on climate issues, on security issues in Central Asia, post-Afghanistan, and in other areas. And that's certainly very positive. And President Biden has certainly shown reluctance to consider any fresh sanctions against Russia, and as we know, has agreed with Chancellor Merkel in Germany for the completion of Nord Stream 2. At the same time, US Congress continues to push for more action against Russia across the board. And the current sanction that has people worried is an amendment to the National Defense Bill in the US, the NDAA, and that has some measures that could further delay Nord Stream 2, but also would extend the existing ban on investors buying Russian sovereign debt to the secondary market, in other words, to already existing debt, and also proposes sanctions against individuals. So again, it's early days. We hope that the White House will be able to avoid that. But it shows you that even though the relationship with the White House is improving or appears to be improving, Congress has a different view. So again, it means that we're not looking at any situation where sanctions are going to completely disappear from the framework. What we are talking about is companies and investors more willing to kind of understand sanctions and risk and are drawn more towards the opportunity. I think the sense is that really damaging sanctions, such as we had a few years ago, that period is probably now past. So if we, in terms of the investment, the Russian response, this is important because on apart from the ban on imported food, which we had as a first knee-jerk response in August 2014, and frankly, this is something that President Putin has been waiting for many years, a catalyst or an opportunity to try and force more investment into Russian agriculture. He's been talking about it since 2010. So it's no surprise that he jumped on this as an opportunity to kind of force investment into Russian agriculture. And as you know, this is now one of the major growth areas in the economy and the third biggest export product after oil and gas. Wheat and agriculture comes next, whereas Russia was a big importer before that. But apart from that, the Russian position remains absolutely clear. They will not do anything to make it more difficult for foreign investors to work in Russia. And yesterday we had Prime Minister Mishustin restating exactly that. He was talking to a US delegation and he said that Russia will respond to sanctions politically, but will not do anything to block investment coming from US or European investors into the Russian market. And that's absolutely kind of bedded in, and it doesn't look like that's something that's likely to change. In terms of the sanctions, and I won't go too much of this, as I say, I've left a report with Raiffeisen to distribute, but these are the main areas. So there has been some impact. But again, we've seen Russia adapting The energy sector was one of the main targets of sanctions, but Russia's oil production pre the OPEC Plus deal was actually at a record high. And we see investment increasing in places like Yamal, LNG, and in big oil projects such as Vostok oil, and in the gas sector. Russia simply turned to Asian investors, to Middle Eastern investors, and changed the way it finances these projects. So there's been really no technology is where there has been more of an impact. But again, through localization, Russia has made significant progress in kind of localizing or diversifying its source of imports. On the currency side, well, previous speakers talked about this. The only point I would say is that the government is actually very happy with a weak ruble. It has greatly increased the competitiveness of the economy. It has greatly increased the competitiveness of exports, and it's one of the kind of pillars of the strategy going forward, maintaining that competitive currency in order to attract more process industries with a view to then exporting product that's made in Russia. So I don't think that there's any appetite for the Russian government to see the ruble appreciate whatsoever. And we've seen that with the oil price. It should be a lot higher. The ruble exchange rate should be a lot higher. It's not. And that's because the government is happy where it's at. And then in terms of just to summarize the government actions, say a weaker exchange rate, localization, I mentioned in technology, diversification is a huge part of now the government's approach. In 2014, when sanctions first started, and there was a very antagonistic relationship with Europe and the US, you will have recalled there was a lot of talk about the so-called Asia pivot in Russia, certainly coming out of Parliament. Let's go to China, let's go to Asia, forget the West. That's completely gone. That only lasted anyway a year and a half. Now the government understands full well that the best position for Russia is to have good relations with everybody as best they can. So we certainly see increasing trade with China, but good relations with Korea, with the Middle East. And for Europe, obviously, has been a difficult relationship. I think I can summarize it to say that Russia has decided that it's not going to get a good hearing or have a good relationship with Brussels, but it wants to have a good relationship with individual countries. So in other words, it's targeting bilateral relations with countries that it can deal with, and it pretty much has forgotten about Brussels and Europe, the European Union Commission, at least for now, but it's certainly targeting countries. And then kind of, I guess the last point to make here is Russia has adapted to sanctions. It's with regard to the balance sheet, with regard to investment, with regard to politics. There is no doubt that the accumulation of sanctions have affected investment, even though there are reports of companies doing very well in Russia and reporting strong profits. The government does have enough of its own resources to at least fund its recovery programs, such as natural projects, for several years, but will then need to attract more investment. So in the next year or two, assuming that there's no kind of unforeseen or unfortunate geopolitical actions, I would expect to see the Russian government initially using its own resources to fund these long-term programs, but increasingly trying to attract more foreign investors with incentives, whether they're tax-based or core investment or otherwise. But I think that's really where we've turned that corner. The next few years, it'll be very much about about trying to attract more investment in order to diversify the economy and create long-term growth. So let me leave it at that. I think I've burnt up my time, and I think the last line to say, credible hope that the worst of the sanctions is over. We will continue to get the needle or the kind of points that I've mentioned from U.S. Congress, but I think the worst is over, and we're starting to see investors now being attracted more with the opportunity in Russia rather than being blocked at the door because they're afraid of the risk. I think that's now changing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christofer. We hope so as well. Thank you very much for the insights you provided. We do have some questions from the audience. One of the questions which is asked by our listeners is the following. To what extent do you believe that demographic trends influence investment decisions regarding consumer product industries in Russia?
Yeah, demographics, this is a huge topic, and we're spending a lot of time now on trying to understand this and what it means for the economy overall, as well as, of course, for individual sectors. Just to remind everybody, the demographic problem in Russia is that the workforce is going to decline by about 10 million people over the next 12 years. This is inevitable. It is the consequence of what happened in the 90s when you had a big drop in the birth rate with poverty and immigration, etc. The feed through that today is, of course, the lack of sufficient workers coming in to replace those who are retiring. So this is a problem the next 10 years that Russia will face. And the only way to deal with it really is to increase immigration from Central Asia, from other countries, maybe in Eastern Europe. So government is definitely, we're going to hear a lot more on this. But equally, we do look at trends in terms of consumption, and consumption patterns. And, one of the unique factors about Russia is that people are very well aware of consumer habits and trends in the rest of the world. If a new product is introduced in California and it becomes the hot topic in California, Russian consumers want it the next day. I think it's I guess a function of internet and connectivity and awareness. But we've seen that time and time again, where companies think that the Russian market will evolve kind of, as they've seen before, the different products will replace. But in actual fact, Russian consumer wants whatever the latest is, whether it's electronic or food or clothing. They want it the same as quickly as it's available anywhere else. And the other factor, of course, not delving too far into domestic politics, but President Putin has made very, very strong promises that he will rebuild the big decline in real disposable income that has happened in the country since 2014 as a result of the ruble devaluation, as a result of the very high level of inflation, as well as the economic downturn. It's probably about 10-12% decline in real disposable income over that period. He has promised and has made several very strong and clear promises to people that he will repair that. And the country can now afford it. Unless you think the oil price is going to collapse, which is unlikely, the country can afford it in the next few years. It means, therefore, that taking into account the demographic decline, the workforce decline, as well as this kind of the way the Russian consumer has changed, and this government effort to repair incomes, it means that the consumer sectors, whether they're services or marketplace or other sectors, probably should want to be one of the biggest drivers of economic growth in Russia over the next 5 years.
Thank you very much, Chris. We have another question here, and it sounds, what do you think about the development of small and medium-sized enterprises in Russia? So probably, what perspective do they have in Russia?
Yeah, well, I think your audience have hit the two main problems straight off: demographic and SMEs. And yes, and this is a big problem. There's no kind of soft way to say it. This is a huge problem for the Russian economic development. And the fact is that the SME segment, small and medium-sized, is too small in Russia. It represents somewhere about 22, maybe 23% of GDP, whereas the state sector is between 60 and 65%. It should be the other way around. Now, it helps kind of mathematically in years like last year. We saw the Russian economy in the headline only declined by about 3% last year, which was a good performance compared to the rest of the world. But that's because the state sector was so large. And now when you look forward, and we listen to IMF and World Bank and other forecasters, they specifically point to this kind of very low percentage of usually dynamic growth segments as a reason why the headline growth in Russia might only be between maybe 2.5% for several years. The government has talked about it on a number of occasions, but in reality, there's very few initiatives. We just earlier this year, we have heard again from President Putin, and again restated at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum in June. He talked about the need to create more incentives to help the small and medium-sized enterprises and entrepreneurs in Russia. But the level of support remains very low. the various agencies in government are also very critical of the kind of poor or weak effort by government to try and accelerate recovery in these sectors. So it is, look, all I can say is it is a huge problem in terms of long-term growth. It's one that's now going to be talked about much more urgently than ever before, but we're still actually waiting to see what happens in terms of financial supports or other incentives that can actually help small businesses grow in Russia. Unfortunately, for the last 20 years, all of the effort has gone to the big state companies. That needs to change. We're still waiting for that to happen.
Thank you, Chris. One more question. You were talking about the changes and reforms which were done in agricultural sector to basically to protect and support local companies. So our viewers are asking, is there any discrimination of Russian companies and against foreign companies, or can foreign companies which operate in Russia can be also considered as local? What's your viewpoint on that?
Right. Yeah, we get asked this a lot because obviously localization is a topic that 5 or 6 years ago was almost, nationalistic. It was, favoring Russian companies to almost to the exclusion of all others. This is when it started first, maybe in 2014 or 15. I can say today that policy has completely changed, and the government has been very kind of open and very clear to get the message across that while it certainly does want to see more investment in Russia, particularly in products that Russia can make in a kind of in an economic way at a sufficiently good quality, but it is no longer differentiates between the owners of the local business. So in other words, if you're an Austrian company and you are, if you set up a factory somewhere in Russia, you will be considered local for the purposes of procurement and selling to state bodies and localization legislation or preference. Yeah, for sure. If you're trying to make that product, in a factory outside Vienna and then import it into Russia, then that will become increasingly more difficult, particularly if it's something that the Russian government thinks you should be making here. If it's something you can make here, then your life is going to become more difficult in terms of barriers and trade difficulties if you're trying to import it. But if you're making it in Russia, even though it's an Austrian company, it doesn't matter. You're based in Russia, you're employing Russians, you've got a legal entity and you're paying Russian taxes, then the government has been very, very clear about this in recent years. You are then a local company for the purposes of localization. So they want inward investment and they understand that they cannot discriminate. I think that the only caveat to that is that if you're in a sort of what we call a sensitive technology sector, perhaps in data management or some other areas related to technology, then there are kind of different rules of the game and you have to do more diligence and be careful. But if it's manufacturing or agriculture or equipment making or services, then no. I think once you're based in Russia and have your operation in Russia, then you qualify for under localization, the same as a Russian company.
Thank you, Christofer. I think this answer was extremely important for our listeners. I think it's really important to hear. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your time, for coming here. Have a good day. And now I think that we need to move forward and slightly and move on to our second session, where we will talk about digital solutions for liquidity management. We'll present our latest digital banking product supporting by real case studies. Let's start.